Hello again, this is Martin Boyle on the Understanding British Policy Processes course at Boston University in London. And today I want to talk about the theme of Britain's post-war development. That's the notion of Britain as a medium-sized power punching above its weight, term that was brought into currency by Douglas Hurd, who was one of Margaret Thatcher's ministers in the early 1980s in the context of domestic upheaval and the Falklands War, which we'll look at later. So we're going to be looking at some key trends and transformations, some of the kind of trajectories and contours of Britain's post-war development from the end of World War II up to Brexit. So the basic themes that we're going to be looking at are, this declinist thesis. That's, the thesis that Britain's declined over a number of decades while trying to remain a meaningful power in the world and retain its prestige. But we'll also look at the structural changes and the policymakers' perceptions around those. We'll also look obviously at the Cold War and Churchill's Circle's view of Britain's role in the world. In the post-war context, we'll be looking at a number of themes through globalism, Britain as a medium-sized power, the special relationship with the United States, Britain's relations with its former colonies, and also with Europe and the European Union in particular. And finally, we'll come up through Thatcher's relationship with Europe, Blair and globalism, the post-Cold War context, up to Brexit and the advent of global Britain, which obviously is your case study and that we're going to look at in another lecture. I think the key takeaway of all of this is that, even despite relative decline, systemic changes, globalization, and the crucial interest of policymakers, civil servants, and observers in these issues and themes, a lot of the issues are structural and they're beyond the scope and the control of individuals themselves. And Britain was kind of in a tricky situation in that respect. So to kick off, if we look at this quote from The Guardian in December 1962, it's a short report on Dean Acheson's comment on Britain's role in the world. Dean Acheson was the US Secretary of State under the Kennedy administration. And I'll give you a little bit of time to look at that. The crucial takeaway from this that everyone remembers is in the second paragraph, where he said that Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role. And then he goes on to reference Britain's weakness as a military power, its roles about played out, and that it should consider joining the nascent European Union, which was the European Economic Community or Common Market at the time. Several British policy elites responded to this statement over the decades. Perhaps the most recent one was Tony Blair in 1999, when he, in his Chicago speech, tried to outline what he saw as Britain's current role in the world at that time. I'll give you a bit of time to look at this. So you can see here the reference to Dean Acheson's barbed comment in 1962, where Blair says, we've got over our imperial past and the withdrawal symptoms. We don't want to be taken seriously for our history. It's what we're doing now and what we've become that matters. We don't want to, be the Greeks to the Americans, Romans. In other words, we don't want to be sort of saying that we taught you everything you know, so you should respect us. What we need to do is really just recognize where we are, be realistic about things, and try to shape the world as best we can in our engaged, open, dynamic, partnering way, to try and influence things. So we've got to engage with the world in order to do that, but we're not top dog. Moving on to Britain's geopolitical position, I'd just like you to consider this map for a minute. Just pause the video. In geopolitical and international relations terms, Britain's strategic location off the shore of Europe is crucial to American interests, and that's America's interest in Europe and in its main rival in the geopolitical system historically, which has been Russia in the 20th century, certainly. If you look at the blue on the left of North America, you'll see that North America, is pretty much of a homogeneous, isolated body there. It's separate from the Eurasian landmass and from Africa. It's got no threats. It's certainly got no geographical threats. The US isn't threatened by Canada or Mexico. Cuba, you can forget about. It's tiny, and Cuba is under a very, very, very heavy US blockade and sanctions regime. So Cuba's no threat to the United States. Neither is Venezuela. But the United States, as a superpower, it has a strategic interest, and it's had a historical interest in Europe, one that sort of matches with Britain's historical interest in Europe, and it has that interest in relation to Russia. A couple of things to bear in mind here. Britain has historically been what's called an offshore balancer for the United States, and that offshore balancer role draws on its even older history of seeking to isolate itself from entanglements on the European continent. What Britain always tried to do over the centuries was to stand aloof from continental Europe and not get drawn into factional fights and so on. Yes, it's always been involved in brief wars in Europe, some of them quite long, but it's always tried to get out again and stand aloof. It's had interests in Europe, but those interests have been driven by its relative geographical safety and the protection of the channel. America has drawn on this to use Britain as what's called an offshore balancer, which is fundamentally an unsinkable aircraft carrier and geopolitical proxy, which keeps Europe in control and in order in some way, in order subsequently to balance the perceived threat from Russia. During the Cold War, of course, that was a threat from the Soviet Union. So that's a kind of overview of the geopolitical situation. Here you can see Britain cracking away from Europe, those cracks appearing in the channel as Brexit Britain shears off from the European Union. And of course, over to the right, you have the mass of Russia, and you also have other countries that are sort of contested and geographically and geopolitically of interest to the United States and to the UK as well. In 1952, of course, Britain detonated its first atomic bomb. The historical context of that, which you can see in those quotes on the left, was one that was driven by technology, Britain's newly surging post-war technology. It had, you know, the nuclear research that it had shared with the United States and that the US had reneged on developing with Britain. The US and the Soviets had already detonated nuclear weapons, and finally Britain did this in its in its South Pacific territories in 1952. But in 1947, Nye Bevan, who was one of the policy leaders in the Labour Party under the Labour government of Clement Attlee, was very patriotic about this. He said, we've got to have the bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. He's talking here about Britain's new nuclear missiles and nuclear bombs. And Nye Bevan's background is interesting. He was a former coal miner from South Wales who came up through the trade union movement, was taken through college by the trade union movement, and ended up as a member of parliament and in government. He was an iron hard socialist, not a communist though. And remember, Britain's position was, anti-communist and aligned to the United States in foreign policy, as with many other Western European countries that had socialist parties in power as well. So what we need to remember is that, on the left in Britain, there was a lot of patriotism at the time, and Britain was still seen as a major world player. The Foreign Office, at the same time, a couple of years later, said we must face the fact that this island is strategically well placed in an advanced air base, and we must accept that role. So from Nye Bevan's kind of exuberant patriotism to a more nuanced, perhaps sober and reflective view of Britain's position in the world, but one that still perhaps recognises Britain's power. I'd like you to pause the video again for a bit and just, with your partners or perhaps on your own, just write down a list of Britain's friends and enemies. So who's on Britain's side? Who does Britain like? Who's not on Britain's side? Who does Britain not like? Okay, that's great. We'll move on from that and just go through a couple of ideas about Britain's post-World War II psychological adjustments. Now, of course, because of the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union and the realities of the post-war world, policy elites in Britain had to adjust psychologically, and this kind of moved on and trickled down, if you like, to policy in a way. And so a few themes developed, and these are themes that historians and political scientists look at. They are relative decline, structural changes, the policymakers' own perceptions, and this notion of prestige. Let's look at this idea of relative decline to start with. Now, we'll look at Churchill's three circles in a minute that he kind of developed to manage that decline. But the context of this really is that up to World War II, we had the legacy of Victorian manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution and Britain's, really strong industrial power and world trading power and its empire, of course. But over the Second World War, the UK became dependent on the US. So Britain's decline was certainly, it was a real thing, but it wasn't linear and it wasn't relentless, and that's going to be one of the themes in this. You know, Britain's decline wasn't linear and it wasn't relentless. It was still a world power after the Second World War, and technically it was actually stronger than it had been in 1939. Britain had a strong executive and there was bipartisanship on foreign policy, as we saw in the earlier slide about Nye Bevan's statement. We had, policy that was developed through a very professional civil service, and of course Britain had its veto in the United Nations on the Security Council as one of the 5 permanent members. The race for the atomic bomb and mutual suspicion broke the US-UK USSR pact, in the immediate post-Cold War era, and the Cold War got embedded because of that. A bipolar world developed with the US on one side, the Soviets on the other, Britain in the middle, but obviously on the side of the United States, despite a strong domestic affinity for the Soviet Union among ordinary British people, especially on the left. And remember, there was a large Labour majority at the time. Britain had divested much of the empire through the new Commonwealth, but it clung on to other parts of the empire in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, parts of Asia as well. The United States were pecking away at this. There was international systemic change. So if we look at the second point there, structural changes in the overall system. Major one, of course, as we said, the United States and the Soviet Union, the rise of the United Nations and the rise of nationalist movements in former colonies, not just British colonies. Britain had to recognise this. In the early 1950s, of course, the precursor to the European Union, the first organisation, the European Coal and Steel Union, was founded under Robert Schuman, with Germany, France, and the Benelux countries. And it later grew to bring Italy in as well. Britain stayed aloof from that for a long time, even though the US was interested in, Britain joining it. Policymakers then had to change their perceptions. The UK needed a new rationale for its global foreign policy, and it had to be under the US umbrella, fundamentally. This was a hard pill for many in policy circles to swallow. Geopolitics required relations between Britain and Eastern Europe, but Britain had to keep the US NATO umbrella, so Britain had to remain under NATO in the US commitment to Europe. And finally, we've got this theme of Britain's prestige, which is constant in the post-Cold War era, in making these psychological adjustments and changes in perception. Policymakers struggled to retain prestige for the UK in the context of this managed decline. These are Churchill's 3 circles, which you've looked at already. We've got the Commonwealth, we've got the English-speaking world, and we've got a united Europe. Obviously, Britain's in the middle, and it engages with all of these circles. Going back to this idea of decline and prestige, in 1952, Sir Anthony Eden, who was Eton educated, upper class, a traditional Tory, traditional Conservative, spoke in a very, very upper class, what we call a posh or BBC or Queen's English accent. spoke and delivered a memorandum on British overseas obligations. And in this memorandum, he talked about Britain's managed decline. What we need to understand is that these guys, although they're they're figures of fun, these Eton educated, upper class policymakers, conservative elite who, they're seen as being detached from the real world in some way and living in the past. These guys weren't living in the past. They had a crucially realistic view of the world as it was, and you can see this in some of these quotes and statements that are taken out of that memorandum. They might not have liked it, but they recognized it and they kind of accepted it in a way. So Britain's great power status has given it great responsibility, and it still has those responsibilities, but it's not self-sufficient economically. There's no world security system, so there's no world army. The UN is not a world army. And the free world, if you like, that's the UK, the rest of the non-communist world, the US, is faced with an external threat, and that threat is the Soviet Union and communism. Moving on with Sir Anthony Eden's memorandum. These guys didn't half wrap up, very simple truths in very fancy language. What this statement really means is that we've got responsibilities that we can't afford. We don't have the money to pay for this. And this is a threat, to our prestige. And once our prestige starts slipping, where's it all going to end? So there's a real sense of anxiety and foreboding among Britain's policy elites at this time. Okay, so some general themes around this issue of decline and prestige. To summarise, as we said before, Britain was actually stronger after the war than it was before the war. Because it had to ramp up production militarily and industrially. There was a strong executive and bipartisanship. Britain had a Labour government that was a socialist government, but it was firmly on the side of the United States geopolitically. And both main parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, were united on Britain's foreign policy. So there was no problem there. Britain still had a very, very strong and professional civil service that had been, educated. The upper echelons of the civil service had come through the top private schools, which funnily enough we call public schools in Britain. Britain retained its veto on the UN Security Council. It was one of the 5 main powers. The United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China, which at that time, between 45 and 49, was nationalist China, the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China. So it was nationalist China under Chiang Kai-shek, which lost the Civil War in 49 and fled to Taiwan, and retained its seat on the Security Council until 1971 as a kind of anomaly. In the second column, we've got Britain's role with the Empire and the Commonwealth. Britain had relations all around the world because of this. Remember, the British Empire was an empire on which the sun never set. It was global. Britain was a nuclear power from 1952. Exploded its first atomic bomb in 1952 and then a hydrogen bomb in 1957, so it was firmly at the top table as a nuclear power. The context of the Cold War was crucial. Britain was in NATO. Britain had air bases that the US used. Britain was part of the US early warning system in Europe. So the Cold War, as it settled over Europe, involved Britain in a major way. Again, Britain's role in NATO, and finally the sterling area. Many countries around the world pegged their currencies to the British pound, and this gave Britain great prestige around the world. The role of the pound sterling as a currency of worth, much as the US dollar is now, was almost unassailable at that time. Let's have a look at this idea of Britain's so-called special relationship with the United States in the context of its imperial overstretch. Now, we know that every country thinks it's got a special relationship with the US. The French think they've got one because they helped the US in the War of Independence against Britain. Canada thinks it's got one. Lots of countries think they're special in US policymakers' eyes. What's so special about Britain? Well, obviously there's what we said before about the geopolitical alliance, but there's this problem of Britain's imperial overstretch as well. I mean, the United States is, officially and formally anti-imperialist, anti-colonial. You might say that this is not actually, in actual fact, this is not the case, that American colonies exist under different names, but that's an issue for another lecture. Let's have a look at these statements. Britain, of all US allies, is in a special or preferred position. The facts of the world situation require it. This is from the National Archives in Washington. So perhaps it's not out of desire, it's more out of necessity. My enemy's enemy is my friend, perhaps. And the UK Cabinet Papers from 1960, the US would be the only power capable of supporting British interests, and Britain's international status would be increasingly contingent upon American willingness to treat Britain specially. So we've got to stay on side with America. We've got to stay in Washington's good books, in other words. And there on the right you can see a sculpture of Roosevelt and Churchill, who forged this special relationship during the Second World War. The special relationship was not without its problems, and as we know, it hasn't been plain sailing. I want to focus on a number of historical events that have seriously tested the US-UK special relationship, and these are all kind of in the context of Britain's declining power, its desire to retain prestige, and the role of the United States and its interests in the world. Let's look at the first one, the Korean War. In the early 1950s, of course, communist North Korea invaded South Korea with Chinese backing. That's communist Chinese backing mainland China, not the China that was in the United Nations. And the Soviets had boycotted the UN Security Council, so the US, the UK, France, and nationalist China were able to get together a UN resolution to send a UN force to Korea, but this UN force was under US control. Truman, the US president, was determined. He wanted to use the atomic bomb in Korea. He wanted to end the war, basically by using, by using an atomic bomb. The British Prime Minister Attlee fundamentally said, no, Britain cannot agree to this. Britain still had enough prestige and power at the time to prevent the US from using an atomic bomb in Korea. The fallout from that, if you'll excuse the pun, obviously is a subject in itself, and a hugely interesting one. We'll move on to the second point there, which is the Suez Crisis in 1956. The Suez Canal was officially owned by a private company, but it was effectively under the control of the UK and partly France as well. France had an interest in it, and it was crucial to the British Empire as a sea lane to Asia from Europe. What happened in 1956 was the Egyptian government under Gamal Nasser, the Arab nationalist government there, nationalised the canal and took it over. Britain was mortified and insulted by this, and sent the paratroopers in, sent a large military force in to take control of the Suez Canal zone. So Britain, with French backing and Israeli backing, they went and occupied the canal zone. After a few days, of course, the United States intervened, not militarily but diplomatically, and said, you must pull out, you must leave. This was part of, officially it was the US position on colonialism and self-determination for small nations and so on, officially. But obviously the US was top dog in the world, in its eyes, in the Western world, and it didn't want Britain acting on its own without its permission. So Britain, much to its chagrin, withdrew, humiliated. This incident sorely tested the special relationship between the US and Britain, but it was certainly the United States telling Britain who was top dog. In the 1960s, the shoe was on the other foot, perhaps. The United States wanted Britain to support it in its adventure in Vietnam. Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, said, no, we will not commit British troops to Vietnam because it's not in our interests. Britain has no interest in Vietnam, which had been a French colony, of course. And again, this tested the special relationship. The Johnson government in the United States had rocky relations with the Wilson government around this particular issue. The UK sterling crisis in 1976, economically in the early 1970s, there was an oil crisis. The OPEC countries led by Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Yamami in Saudi Arabia, raised the price of oil. This severely affected Western economies and really hurt Britain because North Sea oil had not yet come fully on stream. It really affected British industry. There was a decline. British industry was in crisis. There was trouble, industrial disputes and unrest all over Britain. And Britain went cap in hand to, first to the United States to ask for a loan. The United States refused. Britain then went to the International Monetary Fund and got a loan, but the terms were humiliating for Britain and for its prestige. Then in 1983, after the Falklands War, which we'll look at in a minute, and under Margaret Thatcher, who saw herself as regaining Britain's prestige, the relationship was tested again when the United States invaded the British Caribbean colony of Grenada, a small island which had elected a very left-wing government, which aligned itself to Cuba. The United States, without telling Britain, without informing Britain, went in, invaded the place, removed the government. And so that event sorely tested the special relationship between Britain and the United States. Margaret Thatcher was absolutely furious and told Ronald Reagan so at the time. Now, there's no doubt that Britain certainly could retain a degree of prestige through the Commonwealth and the Empire if it was handled in the right way, according to policymakers. Here on the left, you've got a poster that was produced during the Second World War, which paints quite a rosy picture of, interracial, interethnic harmony among the armed forces of the Commonwealth. You've got some British, Australian, Canadian, South African, Indian, West African soldiers as part of the British Empire forces, all fighting together and marching together against Nazism and facing up to Hitler and the Nazis together to defend freedom. Well, that was quite ironic, wasn't it? Because, of course, the colonies didn't have freedom. There were no democratic elections. They were firmly under the control of the United Kingdom. So what did Britain do after the Second World War? Well, it set about building democratic nations and helping in the construction of democratic nations. The first of these in Africa to be given independence was what was called the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. Became independent in the early 1950s, and then that was followed by a string of other African countries and Caribbean countries and South Pacific countries as well. Of course, the jewel in the crown was India. India became independent in 1947 as the largest democratic country in the world, but at the time, because of interethnic and interreligious rivalry, as you'll know, Pakistan sheared away from India and formed its own state at the same time, with East Pakistan separated from it, which later became Bangladesh in the 1970s. At the same time that Britain was building these democratic nations within the Commonwealth and retaining and developing the Commonwealth, it retained a series and a string of overseas military bases right around the world, from Gibraltar, the Caribbean, the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, Malta, down through the Suez Canal to Aden, Kuwait, the Gulf, out through, Singapore to Hong Kong. Britain still had these bases all around the world. And in a British defence brief in 1950, there's this idea that, the Commonwealth potentially is a very, very strong military force that can, challenge Russia and America. So the Commonwealth, taken as a unit, organised to act together, is perhaps better placed defensively than either Russia or America. This kind of rosy-eyed optimism perhaps was also tempered a little bit later, a decade later, by some degree of reality. Remember, we'd had the Korean War, we'd had the Suez Crisis. Britain was in a process of divesting itself of its colonies. And in that context, Harold Macmillan, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, another old Etonian, patrician, upper-class Conservative like Sir Anthony Eden, gave this realistic assessment of the world situation in his Winds of Change speech. Have a look at these quotes. Again, very flowery and flowing language here, but fundamentally Macmillan's chastising South Africa. Obviously, South Africa had for many, many decades had its own government. It was a dominion, not a colony, and it was run by an apartheid regime, which Britain was uncomfortable with. Even old school conservatives like Harold Macmillan were, deeply troubled by the brutality and the unfairness of the apartheid regime. If you look at the bottom picture there, you see a picture of the Sharpeville massacre, where the white South African apartheid regime brutally killed lots of black South African demonstrators. Conservative policymakers in Britain were shocked by this, and this is the context of Macmillan's speech here. Of course, at the bottom you have Lord Kilmuir's response. Lord Kilmuir, again, is an upper-class conservative fellow of Harold Macmillan, and he's chastising Macmillan here and saying, look, we're a bit concerned that you've expressed this this attitude towards South Africa, because we have a colony in Kenya where the white settlers are very afraid that they're going to be murdered in their beds by the locals. And so we need you to be on our side. And at the top there, you can see British troops arresting suspected Kenyan, what we would these days call insurgents or terrorists. These were the so-called Mau Mau. There was a fear among white settlers and in the press in Britain that white settlers in Kenya were going to be murdered in their beds by the Mau Mau insurgency. The data, of course, shows that this never happened, but that thousands and thousands of black Kenyans were killed and interned by British armed forces during that period. East of Suez was a term that had become current in the 19th century at the height of the British Empire, not the absolute zenith, which was after the First World War, but as Britain was expanding its imperial power, there was this idea that east of Suez was the wild and exotic part of the empire, and we can see this in Rudyard Kipling's 1890 poem. Where he talks about east of Suez. He says, ship me somewheres east of Suez, where the best is like the worst, where there ain't no 10 commandments and a man can raise a thirst. So there's this notion of go east, young man. In America it's go west, young man. Well, in the British Empire it was go east, young man. If you're an educated young man from one of the top schools and you want some kind of diplomatic or trading career, go east. Similarly, if you're of any other rank and you want to make a name for yourself or, make something of yourself, go east. There's riches out there. And so the East India Company, of course, is one of the big figures here, and supported by the British diplomatic service to the hilt. Britain had a lot of interests right through Asia, from the Arab world, the Middle East, through India, South Asia, Sri Lanka, the parts of the East Indies, and of course Singapore, Hong Kong, and the South Pacific Islands as well. In 1968, the British government decided that because of Britain's decline, they were going to withdraw their military forces from east of Suez, so there'd be no more naval dockyards or garrisons east of the Suez Canal. This wasn't fully the case, of course. Britain retained a small military force in Hong Kong right up until they handed it back to China in 1997, but effectively, they withdrew from Singapore, which was a massive British naval base. They'd given independence to India in the late 40s. They retained some interests in the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar. These countries were within the British sphere of influence, as were Jordan, Iraq to an extent. Britain certainly had strong interests in that area. Aden as well. Britain finally withdrew from Aden, which was part of Yemen, in 1967, in the context of a civil war there. And what you can see in that picture are Arab soldiers, perhaps under British officership. They could be Emirati, could be Jordanian, could be Omani, but Britain had strong ties and still has strong ties with those states. Let's move on now to look at the UK's relations with Europe in the post-war era. What we need to look at here are, first of all, the Cold War and Britain's relationship with and role within NATO. We need to look at, the difference between Whitehall and Washington's interests. And we need to look at BAOR, I'll explain that in a minute, the British military government, and anti-communism in the context of Britain's military and diplomatic involvement with West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, as it was at the time. The quote at the bottom is from Averell Harriman, who was the US ambassador to London in the post-war, for much of the post-Cold War, the post-Second World War era. And he says, Britain was a global power and didn't want to be treated as just another European country. We had endless arguments to build a strong Europe, so Britain still wanted to, exert a bit of control. British prestige was at stake, and as you can see in that picture, Britain, retained a strong military force, particularly in Germany. It occupied its own zone in Germany at the end of the Second World War, and it did so quite deliberately, visibly, and ostentatiously at times. There you can see some Challenger tanks. Challengers are British-made tanks, so it wasn't using American armaments and munitions. Britain was, producing its own, and this was part, of course, of Britain's prestige. Let's look at the Cold War and NATO first, and Germany in particular. Britain occupied Germany at the end of the Second World War, along with the United States, the Soviet Union, and France. And each of those powers had their own zone of occupation. The British zone was in the north of what is now, or the north of what was then West Germany. So on the northwestern side of, what became a united Germany, facing the Soviets across the Iron Curtain. Britain fulfilled its military role in West Germany under the umbrella of NATO, of course, with US leadership. Britain had several garrisons in northern Germany around Hanover, Bielefeld, Sennelager, places like that, the Ruhr, and it was, very much part of the fabric of German life between 1945 and the end of the Cold War, and even afterwards. Interestingly, although Britain had this role, it came into conflict with American interests at times. Germany was under the control of several powers, and of course Washington was top dog, and Washington wanted to, decide what happened. But Britain wasn't always willing to follow the American line ideologically. So if we look at the third point there, well, this explains it a bit. BAOR is the British Army on the Rhine. That was the official name of the British military commitment to West Germany in the post-Second World War period. Of course, the army was not on the Rhine. It was, it was further east, facing the Iron Curtain. And in the immediate post-war context, Britain had imposed a military government staffed by British military officers based in northern Germany, but responsible for much of the industrial heartland of Germany. And this British military government essentially reindustrialized West Germany alongside older former German industrialists. They brought these old industrialists and German managers back in, and they negotiated a very interesting combination of German corporatism and British social democracy as it was understood under the post-war Labour government. So it developed a kind of democratic socialist or social democratic labour relations culture in West Germany, which has lasted until today. It's provided secure employment. It's provided a degree of industrial democracy. Workers sit on what are called Betriebsrat, which are works councils, and they are staffed by managers, directors, and workers and union representatives. The trade, they have one big trade union in what was West Germany at the time, and it was called IG Metall, which was very, very strong, unlike the dispersed British system. So what happened was Britain very, very willingly and very deliberately implanted quite a left-wing domestic social democratic, even democratic socialist labour relations setup. And we need to ask ourselves, why did they do this? Well, we've got the context of anti-communism there. We need to remember that in the post-Cold War, in the post-Second World War era, denazification was high on the list of Western interests. The Western powers wanted to denazify Germany by removing the most ideological members of the Nazi party. Of course, some were retained because, they had industrial knowledge, they had scientific knowledge, they had, political power and connections that the Allies needed to use. But effectively, as part of the denazification process and anti-communism, and the recognition that communist parties were very strong in continental Western Europe, Britain felt that it needed a degree of, it needed an industrial settlement. It didn't need industrial strife and trouble in West Germany facing a communist East Germany which claimed to be a workers' state. You can see the obvious threat of that to Western capitalist interests. And as an interesting aside, it's quite funny to remember that in the 1950s, the Conservative government in Britain sent left-wing British trade unionists to West Germany to train German workers in how to organize a strike legally. That would never happen in Britain. That would, certainly now in the aftermath of Thatcherism and neoliberalism, there would be no way that a Conservative government would have that degree of involvement and negotiation and understanding with the workers or the trade union movement. Britain was in decline, but it wasn't in terminal decline. It had plummeted very, very quickly in the 1970s because of the oil crisis and the sterling crisis. But Margaret Thatcher came in 1979 claiming that she was going to reclaim Britain's prestige, and she was going to make Britain a world, if not a world power, then certainly a force to be reckoned with. And she was going to do this economically through neoliberalism. And of course, we know that Margaret Thatcher had a very, very close relationship with Ronald Reagan, who came into power in 1980 in the United States, and together they, pursued the neoliberal agenda. But Margaret Thatcher also had a kind of on-off tetchy relationship with Jacques Delors, who was the president of the European Commission. Remember, Britain by this time was a member of the EEC, which was the European Economic Community, which then became the European Community. And Jacques Delors and Margaret Thatcher had very different visions of what Europe should be. For Margaret Thatcher, Europe should be a common market, an economic bloc that existed in order to promote free trade within its borders and to enable industry to develop and business to develop. She wasn't interested in, giving away Britain's sovereignty or increasing workers' rights in any way. On that point, Jacques Delors had a completely different view, and his view in the late 1980s was that he wanted to create what's called a social Europe. He brought in the social chapter where workers were given more rights. Now, of course, this draws on, the historically traditional sort of view that in France and Germany and certainly the Benelux countries, workers have much more security and much better rights than workers in the United Kingdom since Thatcher. And Thatcher was opposed to this. Delors wanted these rights extended to Britain, and of course the British left saw Jacques Delors as their saviour, the European project as saving the jobs of British workers and protecting the rights of British workers. And this idea has lasted right up to Brexit, and it's informed the Remain position of many on the left in Britain. Many on the progressive left felt, looking back, that Europe was historically a bulwark against Thatcherism. Of course, this was not the case. I mean, we know that since 1990, Europe, as in with the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, that Europe went down the road of freedom of movement and more neoliberalism as it spread eastward. But this is another issue. So Margaret Thatcher had a tetchy relationship with Jacques Delors over this, and on the right we can see her on the left with Jacques Delors. On the right you can see a humorous poster that was on a lot of students' bedroom walls in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. You've got Ronald Reagan as Rhett Butler carrying Margaret Thatcher as Scarlett O'Hara. And the caption at the bottom says, "She promised to follow him to the end of the earth." And the bit you can't see says, "He promised to make that happen." With the nuclear mushroom cloud at the back. And of course, this was 1983 when Britain and Europe were on the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. We know now that it was minutes to a nuclear attack, and it was only stopped by the quick thinking of a Russian or a Soviet military officer who was observing the radar and the tracking devices that had malfunctioned. He decided it was a malfunction and it wasn't actually a U.S. military or a U.S. nuclear attack, and the nuclear catastrophe was averted by minutes. This brings us to the anomaly of the Falklands War in 1982. Where are the Falklands, you may ask? They are a group of islands off the coast of Argentina that have been a British colony since the 1830s and that Argentina has always claimed as part of its territory. Most people in Britain didn't know where the Falklands were, but they were a British colony, and there was a very, very small garrison of 100 British Marines on the island. In 1982, the Argentinian military dictatorship on its last legs, very, very unpopular, very brutal. It had been through a very, very brutal internal war against its own people. It was on its way out, and its leader, General Galtieri, decided to launch a war of distraction against by retaking the Falkland Islands. So in 1982, Argentinian special forces invaded the islands, and after an extended firefight around Government House, the British Royal Marines were ordered by the governor, the British governor, to surrender. There you see Argentinian special forces escorting the Royal Marines out of Government House. This was humiliating for Britain, and when these pictures were beamed around the world, Britain suffered a real blow to its credibility. What was it going to do? Margaret Thatcher called a war cabinet. The heads of the chiefs of the armed forces said that Britain was powerful enough to send a task force to the Falkland Islands. It had the military power to do so, and it did so. Within 6 weeks, it had recaptured the islands against a force 3 times its size. It was a short, sharp, bloody, brutal war. It wasn't a picnic, and it wasn't a walkover either. In the middle there, you can see some British soldiers looking determined, boarding a container ship. Britain did not have enough military troop ships or naval troop ships to carry its own forces. It had to requisition commercial container ships to do so. And if you also look at the backpacks, they seem to be non-military backpacks in some way. So were Britain's armed forces underfunded and undersupplied at the end? Did they just sort of make mend and, make do and mend, as we say? But they were all mobilized over a weekend, over one weekend. The whole task force was mobilized, and they sailed off to patriotic, nationalistic cheers from Portsmouth in the south of England. This was, at a time where scenes like that hadn't been seen since the Second World War, and it spoke to perhaps an underlying, sense of nationalism and patriotism in the British population. They sailed down to the South Atlantic. They retook the Falkland Islands, and on the right there you can see a kind of happy smoking, laughing British soldier on the left, pointing at some dejected looking Argentinian prisoners on the right. Was this a sign of divergence or continuity in Britain's post-war trajectory? Was it Britain still declining with a little blip, and retaining its prestige through this little blip? Did the Falklands War halt Britain's decline? Did it change Britain's world status? Did it bring kudos? Did it bring respect? What did this mean? Or was it just a little blip in Britain's, long-term post-war decline? This is something that we perhaps need to consider. A little bit of context, domestic context. The early 1980s was a very, very difficult and traumatic time domestically in Britain. There was very high unemployment. Thatcherism economically was beginning to bite. The old job security that had existed was being torn apart. People were becoming unemployed at a very rapid rate. There was industrial unrest. There were a lot of strikes. There were marches for jobs. There were changes in welfare and the health service that were beginning to bite. And interestingly, the naval base that the task force sailed from was in decline as well. The government had cut the funding to that naval base, and they'd made a lot of the civilian workers unemployed. They'd lost their jobs a week before the mobilization. So a week before the mobilization, some of these shipyard workers had been made unemployed. They'd received their redundancy notices. And then a week later, they received letters retracting the redundancy notices for the duration of the war. And they went back to work. So this is, this speaks to a deep tension between industrial unrest and dissatisfaction, and also loyalty and patriotism, or perhaps economic necessity. Many observers claim that the Falklands War saved Margaret Thatcher's premiership because she would have been on her way out otherwise. So this brings us to some of the further developments in British broader European policy around the post-Cold War era. Remember that the Cold War ended in 1990 with the collapse of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, and a united Germany. The Soviet Union collapsed, and it split into its constituent parts, while other Eastern European countries became liberal democracies and ended up joining the European Union. NATO pushed eastwards in that context, and we can see the results of that in a backward push from Russia in 2022 that's been developing for some while, of course. There are 4 points I want to look at here. There's this question of the united Germany and Britain's opinion on that. There's the social Europe versus economic bloc, which we've looked at a little bit with the question of Thatcher and Delors. There's the fall of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and the question at the end of to what extent do these represent change or continuity? Well, the first point, the united Germany question, was one that was a very fraught issue in 1990. In the immediate euphoria of the end of the Cold War, Germans were overjoyed that they were, going to become one big Germany. What kind of Germany were they going to become? Were they going to become westward, embedded in the liberal democratic West? Remember, East Germany had been the strongest of the Warsaw Pact countries outside of the Soviet Union. It was very advanced, it was very advanced technologically and militarily. It wasn't a weak country. And so there were questions around what a united Germany would mean for Europe historically. A strong Germany had been expansionist to two world wars in the 20th century. Remember, Germany had only been united since the 1870s. Before that, it had been a collection of small city-states and, larger, smaller states like Prussia, Brandenburg, and so on. But a united Germany had been expansionist and aggressive. Margaret Thatcher recognised this. Margaret Thatcher was opposed, although she was a conservative, just like the German government at the time under Helmut Kohl. They were all conservatives. But she was fundamentally opposed to a united Germany because of these fears of German expansionism. Hans Friedrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, was, determined that he was going to, push for a united Germany. And, he got the backing of the United States in this. So the US supported the notion and the idea of a united Germany. And this was a defeat for Thatcher. This happened in the context of social Europe versus economic bloc. Margaret Thatcher wanted to push forward with, the idea of Europe as an economic trading bloc, a loose confederation rather than a federation, against Delors' idea of a social Europe. The notion of what happened around the fall of Yugoslavia is quite important. One of the things about Soviet communism was that it had suppressed nationalism in Europe for decades. Nationalism had been a very, very strong force at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. After the communist revolution in Russia in 1917, the United Soviet Union, the idea of Marxism, communism was opposed to nationalism, and they crushed and suppressed right-wing nationalist movements right across Eastern Europe and independent countries around that. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union? There was a resurgence of nationalism. So in individual former Soviet states, they all became independent. Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia split apart. You had Slovakia and the Czech Republic becoming independent countries. And the anomaly there, of course, was they became independent, but they then immediately both applied to join the European Union, or the European Community as it was, under their own their names, not as Czechoslovakia but as the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And we see this phenomenon. I think Eric Hobsbawm calls it the narcissism of small differences. The nationalist idea that there is any meaningful difference between a Czech and a Slovak for his view of politics is completely laughable. It's a kind of narcissistic idea that you're somehow that different from your neighbour, that you need to have an independent state, which then ironically goes on to join a larger superstate. And that brings us on to Yugoslavia, which, saw an explosion of very brutal nationalism and nationalist wars during the early 1990s on to the end of the 1990s. It started with the splitting away of Slovenia, and then Croatia split away. Serbia tried to prevent Croatia from splitting away. Serbia, as the rump Yugoslavia, that is, tried to prevent Croatia from slipping away. And then the war spread to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then later on in the late 90s to Kosovo. These civil wars were extremely brutal and bloody. Neighbours who had considered themselves Yugoslavs suddenly considered themselves to be of different nationalities, partly based on a religious overlay between, or among Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Islam. These people were fundamentally the same people, ethnically the same, but they, in the 1990s, were convinced by political interest groups and elites that they were somehow racially or ethnically different and that they needed their own independent states. So we saw this surge of very brutal nationalist wars in the 1990s, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War. This was very, worrying for the UK, obviously, as a country that's historically seen itself as aloof from European entanglements. It wanted to stay aloof, but also, had this idea that it didn't want trouble in Europe either. So Britain saw itself as, going in there under a UN banner to try to keep the peace. And so Britain and other European countries sent peacekeeping forces under the UN. America was involved as well, but they had limited success in stopping the local warlords and local militias and armies from tearing each other apart and terrorizing the civilian population. We've heard of the massacre at Srebrenica, for example, and the horrific intercommunal bloodbath that took place in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So that was the context of Britain's European policy. Britain was involved in the European Union, and there were talks around what kind of union is it going to be? Is it going to absorb these Eastern European countries in order to kind of soften this nascent nationalism that was taking place? So what we've seen in the early 2000s is that, some of the former Yugoslav states have joined the European Union. So Slovenia and Croatia have joined the European Union. The others are on the path. The other Eastern European states around, Poland, the Baltic states, the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they've all joined the European Union. But nationalism has not gone away. Polish nationalism is very strong, and you can see that these days in the policies of the Polish government that are out of sync with the liberal values of the EU. Similarly, in Hungary, the policies of the government in Hungary have been persistently out of sync with the liberal agenda of the EU. And you can see this across, large tracts of Eastern Europe. So to what extent does this represent change and continuity? Well, we could say that there's always been push and pull in Europe. Britain is, pulled and pushed as far as Europe is concerned. It tries to stay aloof, but it keeps getting involved because, it is in Britain's interests to have a peaceful Europe. America is also interested because Britain is an offshore balancer. It's a bit like that phrase from the Godfather film where the gangster goes, "Just when I thought I'd got out, they pull me back in." So Britain perhaps has that kind of attitude towards Europe. The idea of change and continuity and Britain's involvement in Europe and in other parts of the world in the post-Cold War era brings us back to this idea of liberal interventionism. Remember, liberalism is a whole raft of different competing and conflicting philosophies, all under a broad umbrella, if we like. So, it runs from left wing to right wing. It covers individuality and freedom and liberty through equality and equity to solidarity and fraternity. And people disagree on what liberalism is. But this form of liberal interventionism perhaps is one of the most abiding characteristics of post-war liberalism. And it's this idea that liberal democracies have a responsibility to protect people globally and worldwide, and to make the world safe for democracy, and to intervene where people are being hurt for humanitarian reasons. So for humanitarian reasons, liberal democracies have a responsibility to use military force to go in and to force regime change in order to protect people, to protect vulnerable people. That's fundamentally what liberal interventionism is. The Marxist critique of that, of course, is that this is just capitalism under another guise, that making the world safe for democracy is actually simply making the world safe for capitalism, because the countries that the West intervenes in are countries which resist the rules-based international order of global capitalism and the Bretton Woods system. You can argue over that and decide which side is right till the cows come home. It doesn't really matter. What realists would say is that the ideology of this doesn't matter, that it's all about power. It's about interstate relations. It's about who's top dog and who calls the shots. So we can see several different countries that Britain's intervened in different ways in the 1990s and 2000s. We've talked about Yugoslavia. One international relations way of looking at it is a form of liberal interventionism under the UN banner, that Yugoslavia eventually fell apart because of the civil wars. Intervention did not secure Yugoslavia. It didn't keep it as one state. It actually encouraged its disintegration, and this was good. This was good for Western powers, because they didn't want what had been a communist country but not aligned to the Soviet Union. It had been a kind of non-aligned communist country which had an uneasy relationship with the Soviet Union under Tito. It didn't want that kind of state in Europe. So it could be argued that this suited the United States and Britain. Iraq, we know the history of Saddam Hussein and the first Iraq War and the second Iraq War in the aftermath of 9/11. Again, liberal interventionism was high on the agenda, and certainly in the media discourse as well. Tony Blair and George W. Bush and his father George H. Bush repeated the refrain that Saddam was a monster. He gassed his own people. The people were living under the control, under the boot of a brutal dictator, and they needed to be freed, whether they liked it or not, from his oppression. Sierra Leone was a slightly different case. Sierra Leone was a small, brief the Sierra Leone is a country in West Africa, a former British colony. Britain went in very quickly and removed the government there, which was seen as not being in the interests of Britain, but also which was behaving in a way that was inimical to liberal democracy. Afghanistan, of course, went alongside the Second Iraq War in the aftermath of 9/11 and the War on Terror. So the War on Terror, the discourse of the War on Terror and liberal interventionism, and the idea that we need to go in and create free societies to protect women, to make sure that women get educated, and to remove medieval cavemen who are oppressing and destroying women's rights and stopping girls from getting educated and chopping people's hands and heads off and so on and so forth. And finally, in Libya, you can see, in 2010, Britain went into Libya and helped the rebels there, got rid of Gaddafi. Again, it was the same discourse that liberal states need to intervene where human rights are being trampled on in order to implant democracy. So Britain helped the rebels. The rebels brutally killed Colonel Gaddafi, arrested his son, who was not killed, apparently because of British intervention. And what has happened since then? Well, Libya is still in turmoil. Libya is still a mess. It's not a liberal democracy, and neither, in fact, are any of the other, certainly most of those states that Britain went into, Libya, Afghanistan in particular. So the idea of liberal interventionism after the post-Cold War period is intrinsically connected to this whole trajectory of Britain's long-term decline, punctuated by its insistence on retaining some kind of prestige through involvement as a world player. Going back to the question of NATO, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. In 1990, Gorbachev in Russia spoke to George H. Bush, and he almost begged him not to move NATO eastwards. He said, please, this will destroy the balance of power in Europe, and it will create a perceived threat to Russia, and it will encourage Russian nationalism and defensiveness. What happened? The Americans promised that they would not move NATO eastwards, and they did move NATO eastwards. Later in the 1990s, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO. In the early 2000s, the former Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been constituent parts of the Soviet Union itself, joined NATO. And finally, we see other countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Croatia, parts of the former Yugoslavia, Albania, which had been the most extreme communist country, aligned with China rather than the Soviet Union, because they thought that the Soviet Union wasn't communist enough, all ended up joining NATO. Turkey was already a member. You don't need to, be an expert in geopolitics to see that Russia has been hemmed in by this. You have countries like Ukraine and Belarus who are not members of the of NATO, But obviously, in 2022, this question of where Ukraine stands is crucial to Russia's feelings of encirclement, and also, to its national pride and its sense of, resurging and pushing back against the United States and NATO expansion. Where is Britain in this? Well, Britain is fully behind the US in the eastward push. It may not have been in 1990, it may have been a bit more diplomatic in 1990, but certainly since then it's gradually aligned to Washington's position on the eastward expansion of NATO under this language of freedom and democracy, making the world safe for freedom and democracy, and being opposed to authoritarianism, defending human rights, and so on. And of course, as we know, this is not very nice. It might be nice for the policy elites, but it's not very nice for the ordinary people who live in these countries. If you're an ordinary Ukrainian person living under the threat of a clash between two superpowers, that must be, quite an anxious situation to be in. Similarly, the countries that the people in the countries that are actually members of these blocs, will probably feel a similar sense of anxiety if they're up against the front line. In a realist world, of course, in a realist international relations context, it's perfectly understandable that the United States and Britain will want to push as far east as possible with NATO in order to balance Russia. It's equally rational behavior for Russia to want to push as far west as possible in order to defend itself. And this is because over history there have been wars which have, eaten away at Russian interests in Eastern Europe, around Ukraine and so on. Ukraine has historically been part of a broader Russia, Belarus also, and over centuries Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have, all at various times been under Russian domination, whether it's been under the Soviet Union or under other systems like the Tsars. So again, we go back to Britain's interest in this. Does Britain have an existential interest in Ukraine? Does Britain have an existential interest in events in Eastern Europe? To what extent are these questions of democracy, human rights, freedom, open elections, opposition to authoritarianism, to what extent are these foremost in British policy thinking, or to what extent is power and defence and security foremost in British interests? And that's something that you can think about. This brings us up to Brexit. There are 4 points I want to look at under Brexit, and these are the question of sovereignty, the phenomenon of migration, which is, immigration in this sense, the idea of the left behind red wall, and the open versus closed spectrum on the political compass, which is a different kind of political compass to the one that we looked at the beginning of the course. So, looking at sovereignty first. Realists believe that states are sovereign. that is a fundamental fact in international relations. Sovereignty resides in the state. It doesn't reside globally. It doesn't reside in the United Nations. It doesn't reside in international trade blocs, federations, or communities. It's within the individual state itself. So for Britain, in terms of international relations, the EU presented a puzzle, because who calls the shots? He who pays the piper calls the tune. No man can serve two masters. Who decides on Britain's laws? Is it Westminster or is it Brussels? You can't have both. You can't have an outside polity dictating the laws of an individual state. So this was a fundamental puzzle with Britain's involvement in the European Union. Was that quite arcane and specialised political argument uppermost in the minds of British voters when they voted in 2016 to leave the European Union? Probably not. One big issue was immigration. Now, migration is a specialist area within itself, and it's a very, very fascinating topic. The question of how populations move around the world, it's a subject in itself, and it's a really fascinating area. And what has happened with the European Union is that there have been two forms of migration that have happened. One has been internal migration caused by the development of the four freedoms under the European Union. That is freedom, one of which is freedom of movement, freedom of the movement of labour among different countries, among different states. The other one is external migration from outside the EU into the EU, partially caused by the economic policies of the EU itself, I might add. So we see massive inflows of people from Africa to Southern Europe and then onwards to Northern Europe and the UK. We see massive influxes of people from the Middle East because of the political turmoil and the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, coming in through Turkey, Syria, Turkey, to Greece and then onwards through Europe. So two kind of general population movements there, which kind of in a way converged on Britain. They converged on other countries as well, certainly Germany, France, the richer European countries, Italy as well. But in Britain it was perceived that migrants were converging on the UK through Calais in northern France, where there was a large migrant camp, and immigrants did not want to stay in France, which was a safe EU country, but wanted to come to the UK. Why did migrants want to come to the UK? Why do so many migrants in fact continue to come to the UK and choose not to stay in France, for example, even after Brexit? Well, it's quite telling that in a recent argument over the Channel migrant crisis, an argument between the British Home Secretary Priti Patel and her French counterpart, who incidentally was a conservative politician, so a liberal conservative, like Patel, although she is quite hard in her attitude. The French counterpart turned round to Priti Patel and said, it's your economic system, it's your free market economic system where there is a large unregulated, semi-regulated labour market where people can get informal work under the radar, unofficially, that draws people to Britain. This is not the case in other European countries where the labour market is much more strictly regulated. So his argument, of course, is that neoliberalism is a pull factor when it comes to migration. Neoliberalism it creates a labour market that is flexible, insecure, and low paid, and that in itself draws migrants, and of course ends up being a threat to the existing labour markets, the existing labour force. For the French Interior Minister who said this to Priti Patel, this was an economic fact. These are economic facts, but it's quite interesting that and he acknowledged it himself, that his argument aligned to the Marxist argument, even though he himself was a liberal conservative. The classical Marxist argument is based on the phenomenon of the reserve army of labour. The reserve army of labour is that section of the labour force which is precarious and insecure and is always there in the background ready to take work when it becomes available, and which can be got rid of and laid off when that work is no longer there. This suits capitalists, this suits bosses for Marxists, and the argument is there that in economic terms, and it's a purely economic argument, that an existing labour force will resist a threat to its security from an external labour force that's brought in and facilitated through laws created by capitalists and by bourgeois interests themselves. Now, what's quite interesting about this is that if you remember a few slides ago, we talked about social Europe and how the progressive left in Britain and elites in the Labour Party certainly were wedded to the idea of social Europe, that this was good for British workers. Social Europe did not seem to have prevented the migration that British workers perceived as threatening their own economic livelihoods. And it's interesting that the progressive left and sections of the Labour Party, the elites in the Labour Party, were at odds with the constituencies, the traditional constituencies of the Labour Party, the old Labour heartlands, who felt themselves threatened by immigration. And one of the discourses that came out of this was that of racism and Little Englanderism. So the idea that the Brexit vote was driven by fear and hatred of foreigners, that old white British workers were essentially racist and did not like these foreigners coming in and taking their jobs. And much was made of this in newspapers like The Guardian, for example, and also on the BBC. So this shows a quite interesting split in traditional left-wing circles caused by neoliberalism. And that is something that we can perhaps look at later, how that has panned out into the open and closed society and the Red Wall. Where did the Leave campaign stand on this? Well, this is a crucial puzzle. At the top there, you can see Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party, former UKIP, who stood on a platform of an anti-immigration platform. The interesting thing about Farage is that he was scrupulously anti-racist in his language. He was not, he never aligned to organisations like the British National Party or the National Front, so on and so forth. His background was as he was a stockbroker. He's an economic liberal himself, and his argument was based on sovereignty and the threat of immigration. But the threat of immigration was not couched in racist language, and he appealed to, ironically, to working class Labour voters as much as more right-wing middle-class Conservative voters in Middle England. So there was a broad, perhaps conflicting set of interests there. The working class Labour voters felt that their party had abandoned them and was threatening the Brexit vote by, suggesting that there might be another vote, the so-called People's Vote. But of course, we know that the critique of Farage and later Johnson and the Leave vote was that it was fundamentally dishonest. The argument that money that was sent to Europe could be better spent on the NHS, and all of these lies and half-truths and so on and so forth. To what extent were ordinary working class Labour voters and Middle England Conservative voters fooled by the Leave campaign? To what extent was their vote driven by a perceived economic threat from immigration? And to what extent was their vote driven by any genuine feelings of racism and xenophobia? These are questions, again, that will go on and are being argued among, being discussed by academics who are in a much more advanced state than we are. So what can we say about it? Well, the fact is that the UK has now left the European Union, and so in a sense that ship has sailed. But to what extent is immigration still continuing in Britain? To what extent has the Leave vote solved the problems that it perceived with Britain's relations with the European Union? And how do the various groups themselves, the Leavers and the Remainers, feel about it since Brexit? In a sense, as Napoleon said when he was asked about the rise of China in the early 1800s, it's too early to tell, he said. One feature in the political fallout that came in the years after the Brexit vote, of course, was the collapse of the so-called Red Wall, and that's the third point there. The Red Wall is, or was, those Labour voting constituencies in the former industrial heartlands of particularly England and Wales that had always voted Labour and would always vote Labour. They were rock solid, iron hard Labour voting constituencies. In 2017, interestingly, they backed Jeremy Corbyn on a very radical, for the Times, a very radical left-wing programme that harked back to the Labour governments of the late 1970s, a kind of social democratic programme that involved a massive shift in away from neoliberalism. That had changed by 2019. Labour's dithering and perceived disrespect for the Leave vote, for the Brexit vote, had cost it, along with other attacks on the Labour Party from outside and from the media, and frankly from within the Labour Party elite itself, led to the collapse of the Labour vote in 2019. And so the Red Wall, many of the seats in the Left Behind Red Wall that had always voted Labour, fell to the Conservatives, and it was seen or perceived by some commentators that this was a message to the Labour leadership. It was core working class Labour voters telling the Labour establishment that they had let them down and that they did not trust them anymore, and that they were going to do the unthinkable. They were going to give their vote to the Conservatives just to teach the Labour Party a lesson and to get Brexit done. To what extent did these core Labour voters trust Boris Johnson? Did they believe that he was just going to get Brexit done? Was it like Winston Churchill, where they thought he was a good leader in a crisis, or a good leader just to get a simple job done, but they didn't trust him long term, like the working class didn't trust Winston Churchill long term? This is another question that will take years and years of research to answer. And what many observers have pointed to is this final idea here of the open versus closed axis on the spectrum. So you've got, rather than what this shows, what the collapse of the Red Wall shows, what the Brexit vote shows, is not so much a left-right spectrum, because the vote cut across political allegiances. Conservatives voted Leave and Remain. Labour voted Leave and Remain. So it wasn't a straight left-right vote. What it was, and what it did show, similarly to the Trump vote in America, was the difference between being open on the political spectrum and being closed on the political spectrum. So, are you secure, middle class, outward looking, cosmopolitan, interested in other cultures, and so on and so forth, as an open person? Or are you insecure, in precarious employment, threatened, perhaps less formally educated, not university educated maybe, and more wary or threatened by immigration? And if so, then you are perceived as being closed on this spectrum. Finally, this shows the political lay of the land between 2017 and 2019, and perhaps puts the Conservative Labour divide into the context of the fall of the Red Wall, and this move away from a left-right spectrum to an open-closed spectrum. What we can see is that in 2017 there were a large number of red areas. Remember, red is left-wing, blue is right-wing in Britain. In America it's the other way. Yeah, I think Democrats are blue, Republicans are red. Well, in Britain, it's the other way. Labour is red, Conservatives are blue. And in 2017, you saw, the northeast of England, big swathe of red there, right across the central belt of, from Cheshire, Liverpool, Manchester, going eastwards to Leeds, West Yorkshire, Sheffield, places like that, the industrial heartland, that was all red. South Wales, coal mining, iron and steel, that was all red. And London, of course, and bits of Kent as well. And also a couple of Labour seats in Scotland, around Edinburgh, and a couple in the central belt as well. But if you move to 2019, a lot of those seats had gone. A lot of them had gone. So a lot of the red wall had just deserted Labour, defected to the Conservatives because they were unhappy with Labour's stance on Brexit, but also other issues around Labour, which we can perhaps go into later, and that is perhaps the shift of the Labour Party to a more middle class, progressive liberal left agenda, rather than an older union-based working class social democratic or socialist agenda. And this is, a big split that kind of aligns to this open-closed spectrum. So we'll leave this presentation at that point, which is, where the parties stand at the moment. In 2022, of course, given Boris Johnson's troubles at the moment and the fact that Brexit is all done now and there's a new Labour elite that's been consolidated, we can probably, view the Labour Party slightly differently now, but that is a question for a different lecture, so we leave this particular run through Britain's post-war decline and desire for prestige at this point. Thanks very much.